Welcome to another edition of Inside the Lab. This is the CMBC interviews with prominent scientists and scholars within the Emory community. And I'm Lynne Nygaard. I was the former director of the CMBC, and this is my last interview, or one of my last interviews, before handing over the reins to Dietrich Stout. Today, I am talking to Kathryn Kadous, the Schaefer Chaired Professor of Accounting and Director and Associate Dean of the PhD program at Emory's Goizueta Business School. So thank you, Kathryn, for agreeing to have this discussion. And I just wanted to start by asking you just to give a brief description of your research and scholarship.
Thanks, Lynn. I'm honored to be slipping in here before you exit the role. Yeah. I consider myself a judgment and decision-making researcher. I examine the judgment and decision-making involving accounting information in professional contexts. So most often I look at financial statement auditors and what processes, judgment processes or operations they use in complex judgments.
Yeah, so
and I could go on for an hour or
yes, well, no, I would love for you to go on for an hour. I was going to ask, what does your research entail? What kind of methodologies do you use? And then I'll ask what fields you draw from.
I use experiments, and they are typically paper and pencil type experiments, which are now, of course, often done using Qualtrics or something like that. But typically, I try to create a task that retains the complexity, since I'm looking at complex judgments. So retains the structure, the complexities of the task in the real world, but of course, it's vastly simplified. And I do a lot of work focusing on judgment processes. And so my work, with auditors is very constraining in that regard. Like I can't get auditors. Well, I don't do fMRI stuff, right? So I can't look at where the brain or where the blood's flowing. I can't get them even to come in the lab and do eye tracking. So kind of the typical ways of looking at process are not available. So instead, we tend to do a lot of theory building about what decision you would make, if you went about it by this set of processes, where you would end up if you use this set of processes. And we embed a lot of measures along the way in the material. So we do a lot of unobtrusive measurement, but not physical measurements.
Right. I'm wondering, what would be an example of the kind of decisions or an auditor might have to make, and how you would sort of tease apart whether it's this kind of process, like what are the candidate processes that might go into a particular, sort of realm of decision making for this group, for this real world, important kind of decisions, right?
Yeah, so financial statement auditors are the people who are kind of standing between companies who are publicly reporting to their shareholders and the public. So the idea is that companies often have this incentive, pretty strong incentive, to put out information that makes them look good, right? A little rosy bias. Right. And auditors are tasked by the SEC and the PCAOB with being independent and making sure those numbers are substantially correct rather than overly biased. So auditing's changed a lot in the I was going to say short time I've been in this field, but it hasn't actually been a short time. But
I would
say
say
even
short.
it seems shorter as I get older, but
Yeah, yeah.
even like 25 years ago, much of what auditors did, at least below the partner level, right? The people who are the auditors who are out in the field, much of what they did was verify numbers, like historical costs, like how much did you pay for that building with a contract or an invoice or something like
Right.
that, and do calculations. So there were right answers. You could use pretty quick processes to get to those answers. You grab the invoice, you scan for the number you're looking for, you find it, you're done. You move on to the next task. In that last, say, 20 years, a lot of the numbers in financial statements have changed. So there are a lot more fair values and other estimates. For instance, if a company buys another company at a premium, then in subsequent years, the companies have to estimate the fair value of the business unit that they purchased,
right,
and make sure that it still warrants that premium on the financial statements.
right.
So the companies have to do these complex things, but then the auditors also have to do their own calculations so that they can say whether the client's calculation is okay. So
Right.
these calculations involve things like assessing management's intent, like, are they going to keep this business open? Are they going to run it as is? Are they going to, basically predicting the future, estimating like future cash flows, future capital expenditures, all these things, and they're all related to one another, right? So you can't take them apart. And then, of course, thinking about horizon, applying a discount rate and condensing all those diverse assumptions into a single number. And that's really complex. And that's the kind of judgment that auditors have to do more and more of. And those numbers are much bigger on financial statements now. So they're more important, right? Those are the places where fraud would occur, whereas in the past it might be limited to revenue or something like that.
Right, right.
So to do those kinds of tasks well, you can't, start with management's number and just say, look for a number in a spreadsheet and check it off and move on. You have to instead conduct a fairly exhaustive search of the information that's available. And more importantly, think about these things in relation to one another.
Right, right.
And so this involves like a completely different kind of set of, I say processes, I think others might call them operations, that you need to do the task well.
Right. So it sounds like an n-dimensional problem space, right? That these auditors have to navigate through, right?
Yeah.
And so what, this is my bias, I think, a little bit as a psychologist. What are the particular measures that sort of give you a sense of that they're going this way, or that they've figured out the problem space in this kind of way versus that kind of way? That's a pretty general question. So yeah. So, maybe an example of a particular experiment, that
Sure.
Yeah.
I can say I have been helped greatly in this area by the fact that the regulator of auditors, the PCAOB, reviews a sample of audits from all the big firms every year, and they write narratives about the deficiencies. So they started doing this right around 20 years ago. And that's kind of what clued me into, oh, they're using the wrong process, because the deficiencies would be things like, the auditors used one number for a fair value in this part of the financial statements, but a materially different number over here.
Right.
And a lot of these deficiencies that the regulator noted were contradictions that somehow didn't get noticed and reconciled.
Oh, that's interesting. Yeah.
Yeah. So one thing my co-authors and I do is design a case that's realistic to the extent it can be when it's condensed down, based on problems that regulators have actually observed. And so we embed in the case a bunch of these contradictions. And that way, one, we get to measure, are they using a process that allows them, are they holding this in their head long enough to, when they encounter this, to actually see that there's a problem. But also we actually have some comfort that we're addressing the problems that auditors actually experience. Since we're getting these ideas from the regulator, who I am sure had no idea how useful these might be to researchers,
future researchers, right?
Yeah, so we're able to embed things like sometimes just outright contradictions, like there's talk in one part about we're building we're building a new building, but then you see in the capital expenditures that there's no allocation for the new building. And some of them are another very realistic issue, which is that the projections for sales for a product, say, are just ridiculous, right? They're overly optimistic, or even in some cases, competitive products aren't taken into account, that sort of thing. Or I guess one common issue as well is that, you have some history and you see management has over predicted sales every year for the last 5 years. But we still see auditors often just taking management's number as is. So do they notice that they probably need to bump it down a little? Right.
It seems so, Kathryn, it's interesting because this is really interdisciplinary work. Yes.
Yes, I think so.
Yeah. And so, with respect to the kind of, I don't know, training that you have engaged in. So, it seems a mix of cognitive science, if you will, some psychology, and then this really deep knowledge of the kind of structures of, the business related structures. So, sort of, who do you hang out with, basically? Everybody, I guess, right? But
well, nobody for the last 2 years, but
yeah, right. I just talk by myself. Yeah.
It is interesting. When I was a graduate student, most of my field is very, very strongly based in economics and very strongly takes a rational decision maker view, despite, and even some people still even believe in rational stock markets, but that tradition is very strong. And I think it took me a long time to kind of understand what all that was doing to me and other people. But even as a graduate student, I remember taking PhD level classes in economics, cognitive psychology, social psychology, which is kind of more where I've ended up recently, and math at the same time, and having the professors all talking about the same thing, but using completely different terms, even, sometimes they even had the same construct, but they went about measuring it in very different ways. So for me, I found this fascinating because I like to put things together, and, I mean, it can be frustrating too, but I found it really interesting, and I found it's actually helpful to me in that I can sometimes, generate a measure, a manipulation that if I had only taken classes or studied with people in one of those fields, I never would have encountered. So I guess the interdisciplinary part started in graduate school.
Right. Right. I was curious because I, obviously dipped into your publication history, and it did seem, and I'm probably completely mischaracterizing what's going on here, but it seemed like you were also looking at some individual difference measures as well, or attitudes measures, some of those things that might be considered more social or personal kinds of attributes that are brought to bear in these decision-making processes. Is that, am I reading that correctly?
Yeah, definitely. In my field, there's a strong distrust of measured variables, no matter how highly, well validated the measure is. So I don't actually do this as often as I would like, but given the types of problems that I've been working on with the auditors that I was describing previously, the people with the strong economics backgrounds, researchers from that tradition would say, just make the incentives, right? It's just incentives, make the incentives right. And, either the auditors aren't, they lack the knowledge to do this, or they're not motivated. So give them incentives and they'll do it right. But what I've been working on and my co-authors have been working on is more thinking about, people as flexible decision makers. And this is, kind of the resurgence of the dual process ideas, with Kahneman winning the Nobel and writing his book and that sort of thing. And then I just happened upon some really interesting reading on how important attention is. This really kind of struck me that there are other ways, and probably better ways than incentives, to get people to use the knowledge that's in their head.
Right.
And so some of those ways are things like just putting them in the right mindset. Right. Just and other ways to focus attention. But some of the more interesting stuff, I think, has been reminding them of their intrinsic motivation for being an auditor. And this is a very stark, very not related to the task at all reminder, but it makes them engage with the task. And, then they know how to do the task right. They know how to find the discrepancies, and they do it. Well, I mean, the overall performance still isn't great, but it's significantly improved.
Right.
So there are also individual differences that relate to this. Right. So most recently I've used need for cognition, which, relates to, well, it's described differently by different people now, I guess, but as it's measured, it tends to describe like a desire to get to the truth. Right. So the thought was that people, auditors who are higher in this will just naturally engage those more, complex kind of relational processes than people who are low in need for cognition. And that turned out to be supported in our, it was funny, it turned out we have been collecting that measure thinking it was related over 10 yees in various projects. So we were able to do almost a meta-analysis of our own work. So it was,
yeah. So what would be like an item on a measure that tries to get at the construct of need for cognition?
I think one is like, I enjoy thinking, or thinking is fun, or something like that, right? It's like a motivation,
right,
to think through things and find the right answer, find the valid, the truth in the matter.
Right. That's so interesting. So you'd been collecting them over many years, and then you were able to go back and look across these various paradigms and
yeah. I mean, similar tasks, but I mentioned there's a huge distrust of these measures in my field. I think, there's just like I guess a respect for the magic of manipulation, which I also have, but
yes, me too.
But I also believe in, when there's like 300 studies showing what this thing means, it probably means that thing, right? And, all these other studies showing that it's not really related to intelligence. It's not really related to any other things we might care about. So, so I guess we were just collecting it when we ran pilot studies with students and with other groups, when it was a little easier to throw in 30 extra questions. It's not always possible with auditors, but it turns out that very consistently across multiple versions of complex tasks, this seems to matter. And then
go ahead. I'm sorry.
We were able to, we wanted to see if we could fix the problem for the low need for cognition people too, because I guess because this has, can further demonstrate your theory, but also, has some practical implications. And we know from a bunch of other work in the field that, these direct incentives are just telling people, pay attention, this is a complex problems, those things don't work. So we were able to kind of prime a non-conscious accuracy goal with a word search. And that actually did the trick.
Wow, that's really interesting. So you give them sort of a word search task as a prime, right? Before they're engaging in this complex
problem
solving in the context of their auditing duties
this is one problem, right? So you have to make it look in some people's opinion, you can only give them auditing tasks because they're professionals, and they'll be like horribly angry if you give them stuff that doesn't look like their job. In my experience, that's not true at all. They're like, oh, cool, a word search task. So we just, we just said, before you do your task, please do this.
And that facilitated the next task, right?
Yeah.
Interesting. I wonder what do you think the processes are that is it this need for cognition? Is that what's being primed? Is that what you're hypothesizing is being primed?
Well, if not that, something very similar. I just think like an accuracy goal, a goal to really do a good job and get to the truth.
Right.
And I think it's hard to say people don't always have that, but this is the idea of attention, I guess, right? Yeah, I want to do a great job on everything, but I can't, right? So I can't go 100% into everything I do. So I'm, what's grabbing my attention right now? So is my goal when I have this. Okay, some professor's asking me to do a study, or, my boss is asking me to do this. I'll do
Right.
it. I know how to do it. Or is it really to,
Right.
focus on this task?
Right. That's so interesting. What do you have a kind of a favorite, a greatest hit, or a more recent finding that you're excited about? And sort of what are the next questions that are coming up for you?
Um,
That's why there were multiple questions there, I realize.
Yeah, I'm laughing at myself because I have a recent study I did with a student that's not in this stream at all,
Mhm.
that I really enjoyed, and it was on stereotypes, accent stereotypes.
Mhm.
So it was completely unrelated, but we were looking at investors listening to management giving their earnings information in a call, like a video call,
Mhm.
which
Mhm.
is quite common now. It used to be only analysts got to participate in those, but now anyone who wants to can, well, you can't probably ask questions, but you can listen.
Mhm.
And we were interested in whether the stereotypes that come with non-native English accents
Mhm.
would hold back CFOs.
Mhm.
So there's a lot of evidence that CFOs get a lot, or CEOs, CFOs get a lot of training for these calls to present themselves well. And often it seems as though the ones who are not native English speakers just don't do them.
Mhm.
Right. So it seems like they or the company are afraid they're going to be penalized.
Right.
And the stereotypes for non-native English accents are pretty negative in terms of
Yeah.
competence and that sort of thing. There are some positive
Intelligence.
ones, but they're
Yeah.
not relevant to
Yeah.
company
Yeah.
performance typically. But our thought was, hey, this is not just a non-native accented person, it's a non-native accented CEO. And we
Right.
know that there are some stereotypes about CEOs too, right? So we think CEOs are, wealthy, smart,
Mhm.
tough, not necessarily nice people, but tough people.
Right.
And so we kind of thought through what would the stereotype reconciliation process be, relying on some of that old Harvard educated plumber or carpenter, I think, work. And what we thought was, what might happen is when listeners are motivated to reconcile the stereotypes, which is not necessarily all the time, but if, say, there's bad news coming out of this person's mouth,
Right.
then they would go through this process where they would take certain of the attributes from each, and they would end up, well, actually, and add some, and they would say, well, gee, the only way this, probably not super educated, probably not born wealthy person can be the CEO is that it was a he in our case, is exceptional.
Oh,
Right. And that,
interesting. Right.
yeah.
Yeah.
So we predicted that the non-native accented CEO
Mhm.
would get the benefit of the doubt in cases where the listeners, the investors, were motivated to listen and not otherwise. And so we found that in a couple of studies, and then we decided to really verify that's what's going on by running a series of other experiments where we had people write out descriptions of the person after hearing them speak and receiving a label, like just an individual who happened to have an accent, which they found through listening, versus the CEO who happened to have an accent,
Right.
which they found out through listening. So comparing all those, we were able to see, yeah, they exactly think this person is just exceptional, an exceptional, amazing person. And so they give him the benefit of the doubt.
So whatever negative attributes, and we've done, actually, I'm so glad you brought this up, because we've done some accent research in my lab.
Oh, cool.
For other, but so there are these negative attributes, but it's the CEO kind of pulls them into the positive, right? Because
it's actually like new attributes added.
I
So
see. Okay, right.
we measured the stereotypes are still there.
Right.
Right.
I see.
So the standard stereotypes are still there. They don't abandon them, which is consistent with the reconciliation process literature that we relied on. But they also think, yeah, but this guy's just amazing. He must like really understand the business. He really has worked hard. Right. He's really,
Right.
Yeah.
Does this translate into, behaviors, like they'd be more likely to invest, for example, or?
Yeah, that's what we measured as our
I see. Okay.
measure in our initial studies.
I see. Okay.
Yeah. Sorry, I didn't clarify.
No. That's incredibly interesting. So is that one of the greatest hits?
I think so.
It's the greatest hit. Yeah.
It's unrelated, but yeah, I think, honestly, I think the intrinsic motivation stuff, where we just prompt intrinsic motivation and auditors engage in such more, they're so much more engaged in the decision process, is really, that's kind of one of my favorites, even though it didn't get into quite as good a journal. But you know how that can go.
I know how that goes.
But I think that's really important going forward, because I'm finding, like, looking at other types of judgments now, like and more recently I'm looking at, like, how do you get the very newest auditors to speak up when they see something fishy on the job? Right. Because they have, they're actually the ones who spend most of the time at the client and on the job. Right. But they're not in a good position to understand what they're seeing always. Right. And they kind of, they get like slapped down if they bring up too many things that turn out not to be relevant. So there's a very strict hierarchy in auditing. So it's really important that those potentially problematic issues get brought up, and, prompting intrinsic motivation turns out to be valuable there, as do, of course, a number of social things, like how you feel about your supervisor and that sort of thing. But I think it's interesting that this, we talked a lot about intrinsic motivation for years, and then it kind of fell off into the, into argument about whether intrinsic or extrinsic was better, which is, not really all that interesting, I think. But
right.
I think it's just fascinating how people really want to be engaged in something, right? It's just that there's too many things to be engaged in all the time. So again, like, focusing them, I think is a really valuable tool.
So, I guess one final question. I mean, I touched on this earlier, and sort of in your training, the interdisciplinary nature of your work. How do you continue to make connections? I mean, you really are at this nexus of really substantial real world, problem solving and behaviors. But how do you keep engaged with all these fields that are relevant, as a busy associate dean and named chair and all those things? Yeah.
I think that's really the most challenging part for sure. I mean, it's relatively easy when you're a student, and I went to the University of Illinois, and there was a gigantic psychology building with all these brilliant people in it who were all like very generous with their time with me. But yeah, that is definitely a challenge. I mean, honestly, I don't enjoy as much a lot of the engaging with the real world.
Yeah.
But that's obvious that I have to do that.
Right.
In particular, I need to make sure I'm solving real problems, and I need to get participation from the firms, from the auditors to do that. The other things, I helped start a brown bag here in the business school when shortly after I got here, and we have people with great social psychology and sociology training in the business school. So I get to see what they're doing, like in marketing and in management and that sort of thing. I try to go to conferences, again, not the last 2 years, but I try to go to conferences in psychology a little bit, as well as accounting.
Yeah.
So, and then, a lot in finance and more economics brand of accounting as well. So it's a challenge. I do a lot of reading of things that I wouldn't necessarily do, but you don't know where the knowledge that you don't have will come from, I guess.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, we think about this at the Center for Mind, Brain, and Culture, the CMBC, because it's an interdisciplinary center. And how do you, particularly established scholars, even if their research is inherently like yours interdisciplinary, how do we facilitate those kinds of interactions in a way that, folks can actually, talk across these fields, right? As you mentioned earlier, folks might be talking about the same things, but they're talking about them.
Well, I hope we have those lunches again. I used to really enjoy those pre-COVID.
Yeah, I am sure that there will be a couple this semester and start back up, but yeah, I think COVID really isolated us as well. So that we're getting
I mean, I went to a couple of talks that the provost had on AI last, spring, that were very interdisciplinary as well, and at least I was from a different discipline than everyone around me, and we all seem to be getting like little light bulbs going off. So
That's right. Well, Kathryn, thank you so much for having this discussion. This is so interesting, and I will see you in real life here in a little while. So thank you so much.
Thank you.